Welcome to the iSpring Solutions webinar series, where every week we talk about e-learning trends, share iSpring tips and tricks, and cover clients' cases. My name is Paulina. I am the community manager at iSpring, and I will be the moderator for today's session, where we will be talking about creating effective infographics for e-learning. And to understand this topic better, I have invited a great expert in infographics and everything that's connected with it, Lydia Hooper. Hi, Lydia. Thanks a lot for tuning in. How are you doing today?
Hello, Paulina. Wonderful to be here. Really happy.
Okay, that's awesome. Lydia, I'm happy to pass the mic over to you to start the presentation.
Okay, great. And thanks again for having me. I'm excited to be here and share what I can with those of you who have joined us today. So, as Paulina said, today we are here to discuss creating effective infographics for e-learning. So if that's what you came for, you're in the right place. As Paulina said, I have been working as an information designer for about a decade, and I'm currently working at Vengage, which is a simple and powerful design platform for making infographics for business. I have done some facilitation and designed some learning activities in a variety of settings myself. So I have some experience in learning and development, but largely I've been doing a lot of design. So I'm very interested in the overlap between the two and excited to hear what you all are curious about here today. So here's my plan for today. I'm going to briefly cover what's happening in e-learning right now and how infographics can help. And then we're going to dive into some research and actually be able to look a little bit at practice around how you can create effective infographics before answering some questions you might have. So as Paulina said, please do feel free to chime in with those questions. I'm looking forward to seeing them. And we'll also have a couple moments in which I will invite you to engage in discussion with me. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. So I'm sure you all are aware that the last year has brought many changes, and one of them has been, of course, people are engaging more in online learning, and it seems as if this will not be changing, that this is, now a permanent thing, that people are looking to learn in this way. Now, it's interesting because there's already sort of been a dynamic in online learning around the fact that attention spans can be pretty short in that environment. And there's also something that psychologists refer to as continuous partial attention, which means, basically multitasking. Basically, when people are online, they may or may not be paying full attention to what's happening. And because of the pandemic that we've been in, I think there's been even more challenges around how to connect with learners through this medium, because we are, a year now into this pandemic, and many of us are feeling a lot of impacts of that, and it's known as pandemic fatigue. So this is a challenge that faces us. I also think there's an interesting opportunity. There has been an increasing amount of awareness and appreciation of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And of course, things like ability and culture very much impact learning. So there's multiple things happening that we can keep in mind, and that motivate us to be more creative in how we are engaging learners online. So all of this motivates us as professionals to become better communicators. Communication is now considered one of the top workplace skills, and so I'm here today to support you in building this skill in some pretty specific but very impactful ways. Of course, I'm in information design, so I'm a huge believer in the power of visual communication, but there's a lot of science to back up why this is so important as a form of communication. Probably most of you already believe in multimodal learning, But there is some specific research around visuals and how they engage our brains and help us learn. When we are taking in information, so often it is through our visual senses. And when we're able to create a meaningful visual, we can communicate a lot of complex information very quickly, and sometimes with even more clarity. And I think what's super important for learners is also visuals tend to be things that last in our memory. And so they help us retain knowledge, and that's really important. So I'm going to be talking more about that today. Infographics, hopefully you're familiar with what they are. Essentially, that's a short term for information graphics. So these are visuals that have information in them that they're trying to convey, and they can be used in all sorts of different ways for learners. Sometimes that looks like presentations happening online. It can also look like maybe a handout that you get with a course. I'm going to be talking less about the circumstances under which you would use them. I think that the situation that you are in, you'll be able to think more about that. I'm going to be sharing more about how you can make sure that regardless of the format, whatever you're creating helps your learner with what we just talked about, helps them be able to learn and retain the knowledge. So you're probably thinking, well, maybe you're thinking, okay, I got that. I'm already creating some visuals. And if you are, that's great. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the top myths that I have found in my work, working with other learning and development professionals, as well as a wide variety of professionals who are seeking to use visuals as part of their communication. So I wanted to outline 3 ones that I have found to be very prominent, and hopefully this also helps you better understand why you might want to learn how to make your infographics or visuals more effective. So the first one is that a lot of people think of a visual as something that's nice to have. So you might, have a specific project where you're like, okay, it's really worth thinking through how we're going to have a visual associated with this. Or you might have, a very huge slide deck and you have 1 or 2 slides that you're like, okay, I'm going to have, a visual here. That's really great. Another one is that, maybe you think you have to be a professional designer to be able to create infographics. I hear that a lot. Or people sometimes ask me, don't I have to be creative? And I put that in quotes because it's never really described what that means. And then the last myth that I think is worth looking at is oftentimes there's a misnomer around, okay, well, I just need something really simple and straightforward, and so that shouldn't take very much time or effort. And so what I've learned in my work actually is that all of these are indeed myths. The first one being that a visual aid is something that's nice to have, but because of all of the things that I outlined before, it's actually becoming a need to have. In particular, because the way we engage online with our reading behaviors is we do a lot of scanning. We do a lot of looking for those places where we're going to get the most bang for our buck in terms of giving our attention. So if your information is very text heavy and people are not really reading it, you're missing an opportunity for them to learn whatever is there. So really the visuals are becoming a need to have. The second one, I would say just patently that we all have creativity in us as human beings, and really what it takes to create good designs is just a willingness to learn. So chances are if you showed up here today, that willingness is there, and I'm here to just strengthen that in you and provide you with some guidance for where you might continue your learning. And then the last one that I think is really important, because that's the bulk of what I'll be addressing here today, is that to create a really meaningful visual does take a good amount of effort. But I think that it's very much worthwhile because that is how you're going to get the results that you're looking for. And I'm hoping that by sharing some insights with you that I can make it a little bit easier for you. It will, by effort, I mean, it requires a thoughtful approach, which naturally we're doing that already when we're developing materials for learning. But there may be some things you haven't been thinking about with visuals and with infographics. And so that's what I'm hoping to illuminate here for you today, and how we can actually evaluate whether the ones we're creating might be best for our learners. Within the field of information design, there is a number of best practices, but I actually want to share with you some of what's come out of academic research, because I feel like that is where we can really justify certain decisions that we're making. So I've outlined here several research insights, and then based on those insights, some tips for you all as you are creating. So the first one that research has verified is that infographics indeed do make, in particular, complex topics much more accessible to general audiences. So as I said before, visuals can aid in comprehension, memorization, recall. They're very attention grabbing, and they can enhance motivation too. So that's really powerful. There's a lot of research that backs that up. So I did not cite every research paper around that, but if you're interested in reading on that more, you can reach out to me. I'll provide my contact information at the end, and I'll see what I can share with you. So the main tips that I have here is when you're thinking about approaching creating an infographic, a good rule of thumb is to have a couple criteria in mind in terms of what you think you want to invest the effort in communicating through an infographic. I would focus on the things that you know that people might find to be difficult to understand. And secondly, the things that you for sure want to make sure learners remember. So what is that big takeaway that you want them to have at the end of the course? And those are the things that in particular you would at least start with in thinking about making an infographic to support learning. So I have some examples here because I thought that might be helpful. This is one example where I think there is sort of a complex topic here that's being discussed. It has to do with performance improvement and how you might evaluate that. And so with this visual, you can quickly see there's two basic elements to that. There's whether or not current practice is poor or good, and there's whether or not that performance is critical or not critical to success. And so based on that, you can identify where people might land in terms of whether or not their performance is satisfactory and whether or not some sort of intervention is required. Now, imagine if this was somehow conveyed in a textual form. It would be much more dense. It would take a lot more time to communicate. A visual like this gets something fairly complex communicated very quickly. And also it's something really useful, right? Because the idea is that somebody is going to somehow see themselves or somebody else that they're evaluating within this matrix. And so they can actually use this as a tool. So I find this to be very effective for that scenario where there's something complicated that you want to convey. Here's another example of someone communicating about SMART goals. And so if this is like really key, piece that you want to communicate to your employees, that you want them to use SMART goals, this would be an instance where using even just something simple like this, where there's an icon associated with each of these pieces of the goal, even something like that really does help that learner get that, okay, this is something I need to put some attention on and might be something I need to recall later. So those are two examples of how you might start to think about what is worthy of the effort. So as we know, it is actually pretty easy for us to make confusing graphics. And so that's kind of why I'm here today, is to help you learn about some of the ways that happens, and most of the time it's unintentional. Some of the most common errors are using elements, I would say, that are irrelevant or just overwhelming, really puts a lot of burden on the learner because it puts them basically into cognitive overload. So a suggestion I have for that is, if you do want to approach a complex topic, because that's what I just recommended you use an infographic for, that you think about how you might present that content in a way that helps the learner move through that material. And chances are you're already thinking about things like sequencing, and you can use that within a visual. You can have parts of an infographic or a series of visuals within an infographic, or a series of infographics that help you kind of parse apart the different pieces, so you don't feel like you have to communicate too much within one graphic, because that is often the biggest error that you can make. So here's an example where we want to talk about leadership styles. There's 4 different styles identified here. And so this infographic, rather than trying to talk about all of them simultaneously, says at the start, here's the 4 different types, and then it goes through each one by one. Now, even though this is pretty text heavy down here, the visual elements really do help the learner distinguish between these 2 different types. In particular, the use of imagery and iconography further cement for that learner what that style is really about. And then, based on their interest, they might decide to dive in more deeply into these details. But at a high level, you can begin to see, oh, okay, there's these different styles and they look different ways. So this is an example of how you can start to think about how you might communicate complex material in a way that's a little bit easier for the learner to digest. Now, unfortunately, if we do create something that is confusing or is easily misinterpreted, that falls back on us. Research has shown that misleading visuals actually cause people to have negative impressions of whoever it is that is conveying that material. And what is really interesting, I found, is that sometimes misinterpretation can happen even if the text is accurate. If the visual is off in some way, is not communicating clearly or accurately the information, that misinterpretation can happen even if the text is communicating clearly. To me, that just says so much, again, about how visuals tap into those parts of our brain where we're really absorbing. And so we may not even notice the text, but we're picking up on whatever that visual is communicating. So really what I want to enforce, and this might be something for you to take to your boss, some of this research, is that you need to place as much attention on the visuals as you might on the text. I think this is really hard for a lot of people that are used to communicating through text, right? We're used to going through all sorts of iterations and editing with documents, and we have to go through that same process when we're creating visuals. And that is something that people may not fully grasp or appreciate. But I think if you can take it into account that you're doing that, when you are communicating not in a visual, that it would make sense that this is just another form of communication, but you still have to go through that process. So I wanted to show this example because I know that the moment you saw this slide, you were looking at this, right? This is what was communicating to you. So there's some great information here, and you may very well read into that, but this is the piece that really pops out. And so you want to make sure that this is communicating the main piece that you want to get out of this topic. I thought this was a good example because also what's communicated here around Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not really communicated here. So you can have a visual communicate something different that's not in the text, and people will still get that. You don't have to necessarily reinforce it in the text. It just says so much about the power of visuals, and you can use that to your advantage. So we've talked about certain types of images. I wanted to talk a little bit about data visualizations, because in particular with infographics, right, we are communicating often complex information, and some of that might include data. So looking at the research on that is really fascinating because there is some contention around how much people actually do use data and learn from data. And so what the research has said thus far is yes. Two things are kind of going on. One is if that person has a high value for science, and so if your learner is in a role or in a company even that has a value around data or evidence-based information being something valuable, and that person really values science, then data visualizations can be really effective because that person is immediately getting that this is data backed and therefore more valid. The other piece that comes into play, though, is if someone is not so much influenced by science or has sort of a pre-existing attitude that the data might refute, that can be a challenge. And so what the research has said in that instance is that if somebody has no clue and you show them a chart, then they are more likely to say, oh, okay, now I have a new understanding. But if somebody sort of has an existing attitude about the topic and you're trying to present data that actually might challenge that attitude, you might actually need to show them the numbers. So that would be shown particularly in a table, which you might not think of as a data visualization because it's not super visual, but I found that to be really interesting in the research. Another thing that research has shown is that when it comes to the type of data visualization that you might use, bar charts tend to be, generally the easiest for people to understand really quickly. So if you're not really sure about all the different types of data visualization forms, a bar chart is just a really good go-to example. And so here is one. Obviously, the topic here is about remote working, and this is probably based on survey data. And so this bar chart is showing, what the majority of respondents answered. I, in particular, appreciate that the highest responses are colored. That really helps the learner grasp onto that and get the insight. And then if they're interested in seeing how much lower those other ones were, they can visually see that as well. So a lot can be communicated very quickly through a data visualization, especially a bar chart. So let's talk a little bit about how far to go with sort of the visual embellishments. I've showed you several forms. I've showed you illustrations. I've showed you now data visualizations, icons, different things that you might use that are images in your visual. And in general, I would say that those are used, as we said in the beginning, because that is oftentimes what people will remember. However, I also did say that if you overwhelm your learner with all different kinds of material and visual elements, that it actually can backfire. And so this, I think, is probably the key thing for you to focus on when you are working on your infographic. Probably a lot of the tips I've already given you are fairly intuitive. I think this is the one that requires the most thought, is really finding that balance where you can have enough visual elements that really engage your learner, but not go overboard so much that you're asking them to take on too much. So I think the examples I've shown you here today demonstrate a balance. This one is actually an outlier from what I've shown you thus far because it's super colorful, but I did want to show you that this one has a lot going on. However, I know that it is going to be very memorable. And I think the use here too of photographs or cartoons, other forms of images here makes this even more memorable. The subject here is what is your teacher personality, which is already pretty fun. And then, if you know that you're a buddy teacher personality and you're like, oh, right, I'm like Sister Mary Clarence in Sister Act, like you're going to remember that. That is going to stick in your mind. And so Photos also can be a really useful tool. And I think in this instance, even though there's a lot going on visually, somebody is probably going to connect with one or two particular pieces, and that's going to be what they take away. So you can use a lot of color and embellishment if somebody has a way that they're already going to filter that information. Because at the end of the day, right, we want learners to get it at a glance. We want them to see the visual, they have that aha, and it really cements in them. As I mentioned earlier, there is kind of a thing going on where they're looking at a visual and they're having to balance looking at the text and looking at the visual that might accompany that text. And in general, of course, you would expect that learners are going to spend the most amount of time looking at the text. So if your visual is wanting to serve the function of helping that learner get things at a glance, it would follow that you probably want to limit the text that you're using that accompanies that. Especially if you have a message that you just feel like you want to deliver pretty quickly and you want people to get pretty immediately. So here's an example. In this visual, the visual element in particular, this arrow, this colored arrow, is taking up the bulk of the space. It's taking up the bulk of the energy really of this piece. And so I can see, yes, there's different components to the ADDIE model. I can see what they are and that they connect to one another. And then chances are, if somebody wanted to go into more depth on these elements, those would be on other slides or in handouts or something like that. So when it comes to presenting a visual with text, I would very much say it's best if you can present that in a way that's really succinct. In particular, if you can present that first and foremost, it helps people kind of connect and hook into the topic. And then if you need to support that later with more text, you can do that. But being able to keep it fairly minimal and direct in the beginning really helps your learner focus their attention. And lastly, I know we've gone through a lot here, and I'm sure you have questions. I'm looking forward to hearing what they are. Lastly, I want to say that, when we are creating and we're choosing those visuals that we want to use to put into our infographics, it's unavoidable that we're going to make some assumptions about what we think is most appropriate. What photo should we use? What icon should we use? Those kinds of decisions you can make based on practice and based on best judgment. But at the end of the day, you can't fully know actually how your audience is going to interpret that until you ask them. So I am a huge believer in testing the visuals that you're developing, specifically with people who are like your learners, so that you can learn as you go how to create more meaningful visuals. So we were talking about how when you're writing a paper or something like that, you're going through different editing versions and you might have people proofread. It's a similar sort of thing. You would have somebody look at the visuals and say, what's most memorable to you about this, or what really stands out to you, or what do you think this means? And that will really help you better understand if what you're creating truly is going to help that learner. This is particularly necessary if there's some sort of cultural difference between you and that learner, or I would say even an ability difference, a difference of all different kinds that would be hard for you to understand without asking them explicitly. So I hope you can integrate that into your practice at some point. Here's an example I thought of where, this is great. We've got some icons associated with these different stages of organizational development. However, I don't know if this particular icon really does communicate performance unless I am eliciting from someone else, like, what do you think that this really means? These are actually pretty good, but I do think this is an instance where there could be some ambiguity around what the meanings of these icons are. So if it's very important, the material that you are trying to convey to your learner, I would, assess whether it's worth you trying to test that in advance to make sure that there's not any misinterpretation happening, as we talked about earlier.
There are some questions that I marked, and you can go ahead and start, I think, with the first one.
Okay, great. I'm going to answer this one. What would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind for new builders? So I think what you mean by that is, what's the most important thing to keep in mind for people who are new to creating infographics? And I do feel that I said that, but it was kind of probably multiple things. So I'm going to go back to probably the first thing I said, which was, think about the visual that you most need to create. And that would be based on 2 criteria. What is something really complex that will be much easier to communicate in a visual and will take a learner a lot more time and effort to learn in a different way? And the second criteria was, what is the thing that you most feel that people need to remember? And when you've been able to answer those questions, then you can prioritize what is the thing that you really want to focus on creating. So I'm happy to come back to some of these other questions, in particular the ones that I know I'm not going to answer shortly. But for now, I am going to go ahead and continue with the rest of my presentation. So some of the questions that were already coming up, I'm sure, allude to this, which is that when you know some of the things I've shared, like you have a good idea of sort of the questions you should ask yourself and what are some of the guidelines you should keep in mind, it can still kind of feel like this is not something overly easy to do. And some of that comes down to, of course, we are having to use software often to create these. And chances are, if you're on this webinar, you're using iSpring and you're using PowerPoint. So I wanted to talk a little bit about PowerPoint and using that for infographics. I personally use PowerPoint when I'm creating presentations, so I do understand the usefulness of that. But I don't think that it was created for making infographics. And so it's just not the best tool. You can use it, but what I've learned is that it takes a lot of time and effort to learn how to get really good at PowerPoint, good enough that you would be able to make really great infographics. So you might relate to this story from Dr. Amanda Stirk. She was using Word and PowerPoint to create all kinds of materials, but because they didn't offer a lot of design flexibility, the content was really wordy. Like she was, a lot of the content she was creating was very text heavy just because it was pretty tricky to try to figure out how to integrate visuals into that. And that's partly why she wasn't able to make materials that were particularly memorable, because she needed those visuals to be able to do that. So Dr. Stirk started using Vengage, and that is a online solution for creating infographics. For you all here today, I am excited to offer you this promotional code where you can get 20% off for 3 months. There is a free version of Vengage, so you're happy to test that out free. But this code is for if you want to have an account where you would have more features and more capabilities available to you and be able to test that out. So one of the things that makes Vengage really, there's a lot of things that make it easy, but one of the things that makes it really easy, in particular for folks that are in learning development, is there's a lot of templates that are already created that you can go in and modify that are very relevant to topics you might already be approaching. So you have the opportunity to use ideas that have already, for visuals that have already been generated. And then the other thing that's really great is you can actually export a lot of these to PowerPoint, and then you can just use them in the PowerPoint software, so that if you're using iSpring, that still works very well as a workflow. So I want to demonstrate for you, and while I do that, Polina is going to put into the chat a blog that I wrote. This is an additional resource for you, where you will be able to see, I didn't mean to stop sharing. In that blog, I go through in some detail how to best use or how to, I'm going to walk through a little bit right now, but I wanted to make sure you had that blog because it's just a good resource on how to use PowerPoint, but also be able to create good infographics. So I wanted to demo for you really quick here what the Vengage tool is like so you can just get a chance to look at it. So let's just say my scenario is that I want to create something that's going to help people right now in this age of remote working. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to click on templates when I get to Vengage.com, click on templates, and I already have a lot of options here. I can sort by different categories. I can browse here, but I'm actually going to use the search function because I really like the search function. It can go directly. Wow. Okay, so there's almost 200 templates related to this topic. That is a lot for me to choose from. So when I'm looking for a template, some of what I'm looking for is how much content do I want to try to convey? Format, so how am I going to do this? Do I want to have presentation slides? Do I want to have something I'm going to share on social media? So that would be another thing. Sometimes I look at style. If I know there's a certain kind of feel I want to have out of it. So let me give an example of that. Like this looks very pretty corporate. So if that's really important that I keep things, you know, looking that way, I could use that one here. This might be something that would be a little more, this style might be a little more appropriate for an audience that really wants me to be colorful and cheerful around the material I might be conveying. So I actually think I'm going to choose this one. I think it strikes a really good balance between looking very professional, but also being pretty attractive. So what I can do is I can click preview here and it'll show me the whole template and it'll give me an idea of how I can use this template here. I really like this one. I think it's simple and this is just the right amount of material I want to have for this infographic I'm creating. The format of this is would be perfect for like a website, but actually I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to email this out to employees at my company because email is a way that a lot of my coworkers like to communicate and get information. And when I share this visual with them in the email, that's really going to make the email one that they want to read. So I know for certain that they're going to learn something from this material I want to give them, and I want to make sure that they are able to get it in a way that makes sense. So now I've got this template open in my editor. So I can change all kinds of things about this graphic. I like this icon, but let's say, you know what, I actually want a photo here because I think that works better. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to actually type remote work again. I'm going to see what photos come up. So all of these photos are public domain photos. These are photos that are free to use. You will have a license to use them. Let's see. I like that one okay, but not too much. Let's try. I could choose any one of these. I'm just going to choose that one. Now, if I want to replace the icon with that one, I can just delete the icon. I did that by clicking delete, and I can just slide that photo right in there. These pink lines are helping me figure out how I can align this with what's up there. So I like that. This one's cutting off a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that over. See, I'm going to wait for that alignment to happen. And now that's ready to go there. So let's say I also want to change the text here. I don't really like the word productively. I'm going to say how to work efficiently. So So I just typed right, I just selected that and I'm just able to type right in there. I can change all kinds of things down here. Let's say that I want to change some of these colors. I just want to have all of the numbers be this blue color. So I'm going to select that background. I'm going to go in here to my color palette. And down here, I've got all the colors that are in this template. So I can find the color that is associated with that one, and I can change that really easily. I could do that for all the icons if I wanted to do that, or for all of these numbers. Let's see, what else do I want to change? So I actually do like icons, so maybe I want to add icons for these different steps. I'm going to go over here to icons, and I'm going to say, can I find an icon for a schedule? So there's a lot of icons in this library, a lot. I can search and search and search to find the one that I think is best. I'm going to go with this one. Now these icons that show up in this bright blue, these are ones that you can change the color on, which is pretty cool. So maybe I actually want to make the icons be different colors, even though the numbers are not going to be. So I could create an icon for each of these steps. Now down here is a logo for HR Tools. I don't work for HR Tools. I'm going to delete that. Again, I'm using my delete button on my computer. And I can go over here to image uploads. And I have uploaded my logo here. And that was really easy. I just dragged and dropped it right in here. And so now when I click on that, I can just have my logo right here and just add that right to the template. So this is looking pretty good. I'm ready to share it. I'm going to go over here and I can download it as a PNG. I can download it as a PDF. I can download it in a PowerPoint format. So when I do any of those, then I'm able to import it into whatever it is I want to use. In this instance, it was an email. So I'm going to upload probably a PNG into the email. So hopefully you agree with me that this is a really straightforward tool, and you can create really professional looking designs quickly and easily. And again, I just wanted to make sure that you know I have that discount code available. I'm going to display that for you all now. And Paulina, if you can share that last resource, which was a link to this page on Vengage. It goes into more detail about how Vengage has a lot of different features I did not cover here that might help you as a learning and development professional. So that's the page, and then again, this is the code.
Go over to the questions. The first one is, how do you pay for the Vengage graphics?
Yeah, so all of the templates, there are many that are free. There are some that you would have to be you would have to have a certain type of account to be able to access. And so when you go to Vengage.com, you can look at the different options that are available in terms of those different accounts. But there is a free option if you wanted to try the platform out. And then there's this code here if you want to have a discount and explore it for, explore a different type of account, a not free account for a few months. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And another question from Radovan. How do we connect at best the infographics with a narrative text?
Yes. So there's a couple things I think you can do to help with that. Oftentimes a learner, as you probably might have even noticed you were doing when I was showing my slides, they will see the visual first and then they will read some of the text around it, in particular the title, and possibly some other text that's bold or somehow jumps out at them. I think it's really great if those work in tandem. So making sure that whatever visual you have connects to a title or header text is really important. So whether that's the header saying, this is the main insight and the visual is showing, what that main insight or takeaway is. That can be one really good way of doing it. And then some of the other examples I showed you where you can use an icon or a photo or something like that that's next to the text, that would just help somebody better be able to navigate, but also feel like they can have something visual in addition to the text as they're sort of reading through the material. And it might be better if I actually show rather than tell with that. So I'm going to try to find an example of that. Polina, if you want to prep the next question. This would be a good example of that. So having the icon and then whatever the text is that's associated with that here. That way somebody can just quickly see, oh, right, there's these 4 stages. And then they probably will go in and read about the stages if they feel they need to.
The question connected with Vengage is if it's a PowerPoint add-on and if it's compatible with iSpring. What is it? What is Vengage?
Yeah, Vengage is an online software solution. So it's web-based. And as I showed, you can export a PowerPoint file once you have created whatever it is you're creating. When you export that file, you would then import it into PowerPoint, where you could use it in connection with iSpring. So it's not a PowerPoint add-on. It is a separate entity. And if you read that blog that Polina shared a link to, it will go into more detail about that.
Another question that we have is if you should create an infographic in a particular order, such as text first and then adding the visuals, or is there another way you can do that?
That's a great question. So I remember when I was answering what's the most important thing, I was talking about how make sure you're thinking about what's most complex and what's most memorable. So I'm going to talk about those 2 situations. Let's say you're talking about something that's really complex. Here was the example I showed. In this instance, actually what you need to do is you have fully in your mind the knowledge that's in the textual information. And you're kind of setting that aside and you're saying, what do I want to convey? So you do need to know what the information is, but you are thinking about the visual first. You're thinking, how am I going to convey this in a way that's going to be easy for somebody to understand? And you're going to think about what that visual is that you're creating. And then once you create the visual, you can figure out what are the textual components that I need to have in this visual to help somebody understand the visual. So that's one approach, and I would say that's really good approach if the material is particularly complex. The other situation I presented was you want to make sure it's really memorable. And so probably in that instance, and they're not always 2 different instances, but let's say they are in this, for what I'm explaining here now. I would say identify what those key things are that you want people to take away. And I mean really high level. So for this one, it would be, I want people to know what SMART goals are. I want them to know what SMART is an acronym for. It would just be so basic, right? And then from there, you could say, okay, so I should probably have some sort of visual for specific, something for measurable, something for achievable. This would be a way that you would start with the text and then have the visuals support the text. A lot of it comes down to the content you're trying to convey. So I would say it's not an either, it's very context specific as to what I would recommend for the situation, but hopefully, you know, I've provided some way for you to think about what might work best in your situation through these 2 examples. That's a good question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we can cover maybe a couple of more
Yeah.
questions and then wrap up the session. So Melissa is curious, what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind for new builders?
Right, that is the question I answered earlier, which is think about the ones that are difficult to understand and think about the things that you definitely want them to remember. Those would be the things that I would, with your criteria, like when you're thinking about what are the visuals I need to create. Because I think when you're able to do that, you help yourself, you know, better understand that you don't have to do everything. You don't have to, start with what's most important. And if you're new, then chances are you need to kind of keep it simple in the beginning while you're still learning.
That. And there was another question about getting a boss to understand how time-consuming
Yes.
great infographic can take. Uh, didn't catch it. Were you able to cover that question?
I touched on it a little bit, and what I talked about is this, I think, was the place where I talked about it the most. Two things I would emphasize. First of all, that if you don't spend the time to create good visuals, there's a good chance that you're going to mislead your learners. And that's not only bad for them, because of course they won't learn the way you want them to, but actually it can make you or your company look bad. So that's something your boss probably cares about. The other thing is just how I talked about, the expectation is, this is one of the big myths of visual aids, like, okay, it's really simple, it's not going to take much time. That's just not true. And so just like it takes time to develop any sort of communication, whether that's an email or a white paper or whatever it is that might be more text-based, that takes time. A visual takes just as much time, and there's research that backs up that the learner is spending, time and effort trying to understand that visual. And even if you got the text all right and you got the visual wrong, you can miss a mark. So you need to invest the effort in making sure your visuals work. I hope that's helpful. I think the only other thing I can think of is the last thing I was mentioning, which was about um, how sometimes we can miss the mark and not understand that we've miscommunicated something. So if you actually have a situation where that's happened, where somebody misinterpreted something, and you can, share that with your boss, like, in this situation, somebody actually did not understand what happened, and like that's an actual case study that you have, that would be also super helpful, I think, for you to share and saying, this is why we have to think these things through. And the only way you're going to know that really is if you're doing the testing and you're actually asking people the questions of, did you fully get this, or what did you think came out of this? And then you'll have that sort of evidence.
Where can people find specific infographics for specific business or industries? Scare,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the first thing I'm going to say is Vengage, because there are so many. As you saw, I searched for remote work and there were 200. So that's just searching for remote work. Like there's hundreds and hundreds. So that's a great place, and many of them are free for use. And a lot of Vengage users use the templates. They don't always even recreate new ones. So that's the first place I would go. There are other places out there that create templates, but I think what I appreciate and why I work for Vengage is our company is fully dedicated to the idea of the informational graphic. Some of the other graphic platforms, for example, Canva is like a really well-known one. Again, it's similar to PowerPoint. It just wasn't created for informational graphics. It was created for social media graphics, and that tends to be the main situation in which people are using that. So they're not super thoughtful about what are the specific considerations that need to be taken into account when what you're delivering is highly informational and potentially complex or data driven. So I find that the templates that Vengage have are super high quality because that commitment is there, that the material be accurate and that it be conveyed in a way that's really meaningful for people.
Actually so exciting. I always love when our audience, when our dear users and clients can get equipped with another great tool to make their learning more interactive and digestible by their learners. And thank you very much, Lydia, for sharing your expertise and um, just providing so many great advice and tips for our today's attendees.
It's really been a pleasure, and please do feel free to email me if I didn't get to your question. We did cover a lot today, so I'm really hoping that you are walking away with something you can use immediately and to help your learner in this stressful time.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank everybody for coming today, for spending this valuable time with us. And I think I will see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a lovely day. Bye bye.
Thanks, Belina.
Bye, Lydia.